really the mission was formative place for me, actually. Like that whole Valencia stretch, like the it used to be like what we call the communist building on 16th and Valencia. Now that's an Arab Resource and Organizing Center, which is what I was a founding member of, so it all kind of comes full circle.
That was Reem Assil, chef and founder of Reem's California. I'm Jeff, and this is Storied San Francisco, a podcast all about the artists, activists, and small businesses that make this city so special. In this episode, meet and get to know Reem. From her parents' immigration from Syria and Gaza to the US in the late 60s, to her upbringing in suburban Boston, it's a story that would involve food, activism, war, organizing, and an eventual move to Northern California. Here's Reem.
I was born on a quiet afternoon.
You remember that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And
I've
then
been told.
It got noisy after
Yes.
that. Yeah.
So I grew up, I was born and raised in the first part of my life in a small suburb of Boston, Massachusetts.
Heard of it?
Yeah. And I grew up in a Palestinian Syrian household. My dad is Syrian from Damascus and my mom is Palestinian from Gaza. But they were refugees in 1967. So she spent the better part of her formative years in Beirut.
Okay.
And they met there in Lebanon and immigrated here. My dad had already been out here for a few years, went back to find a wife. And
and I guess it worked out
they
for him.
settled in the East Coast. And my life growing up in a very small, predominantly white suburb of Massachusetts it's an interesting one to say the least. I think growing up, the Arab culture was very vibrant inside the household. I think my parents were definitely of that generation that wanted to make sure that we didn't forget our roots. And so that was in our food. And we went to the mosque every Sunday and all of the things, community gatherings. Like my dad literally, I've been told stories where when he first moved to Boston, opened up the white pages when we had those.
Oh yes, I remember those big,
and found
thick
anybody
books,
with the name Muhammad and called them.
Oh my
said,
God.
I'm new to town.
That's so resourceful.
He is.
I love that.
My dad was definitely a community builder. I get that part of my upbringing from him.
Do you know why he went to Boston or Massachusetts? Why there?
Actually, the first place they landed was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Amish town, which was a real culture shock for my mom. But that's where the engineering jobs were. My dad was. He first went to Chicago. He went to the University of Illinois for his grad, and that's where the jobs were. So that's where they went. And then, of course, my mom was like, "We can't stay here."
Right. Well, both places, Chicago and Boston, very cold.
Very cold.
For a lot of the year.
Yeah. And in fact, when my mom's side of the family started to immigrate over here, they all moved to California. So we were the only ones on the East Coast, and I always thought I was a Californian trapped in an East Coaster's body.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. But
so you came to, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but you came to visit parts of California when you were little? Okay.
Yeah. So my grandparents settled in the town of the city of Northridge. Literally,
I've
right.
definitely heard of that one.
Yeah, literally right before the epicenter of the big earthquake, and their
so
house
early
was
90s.
ruined. Yeah.
Oh.
I was like, this is the weird irony of. Both my grandparents, my grandmother is from original Jaffa. She experienced a Nakba, which in Arabic we call a catastrophe, where, hundreds and thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homeland. So she experienced that and then was a refugee in Gaza and then experienced being expelled in 1967. And then, my lived throughout Beirut during the 70s, during the Civil War, in which their home experienced wreckage. So to come to
now it's
the one
the
of
earth.
the city, they're like, yep, that makes sense. But they know how to rebuild, right? So
right.
Anyway, so I just think that's a funny story of that feels like that checks. But their home has been repurposed. They passed away a few years back leading up to the pandemic. And my mom actually took over that house and rebuilt it. So it's like it's a house that tells a story. But anyways, our summers were spent in that home in San Fernando Valley. Every summer, everybody from all across the globe. My mom comes from a family of 6 siblings, and they all kind of lived in different pockets. And
you have approximately 1 million cousins?
1 million,
something like that? A couple 100,000?
Yeah. On my dad's side, for sure. We had to write them down. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that helps.
He was the youngest of 8 children, and my grandparents had him when they were much older. So those sisters had kids who had now kids.
Yeah.
So we had to map out every time we would visit Syria.
Like a family tree kind of?
Totally. Because you have to bring gifts for everybody, and you can't forget anyone.
Oh, my God.
So it was quite an upbringing of kind of having very, very strong Arab culture, but then also we were latch-key kids, and both my parents worked. My mom went back to school, and we grew up on top ramen and macaroni and cheese, and just anything.
Kraft macaroni.
In the box.
Yes.
And just trying to reconcile those two identities of being the ambiguously brown kids in our school, and it was an
in a place where
upbringing.
You might stand out more than, let's say, here.
Yeah.
Can you give us a rough kind of main decade that you grew up?
80s, 90s
80s,
kids.
90s, got it. Yeah, when you said latchkey, I was like, I think there's...
Yeah, high school years, when all the best music came out.
I was just about to ask about music. Let's hear your life. What music were you into?
I mean, I was kind of it's a funny... I was I really loved ska and alternative music, but also very, very much 90s hip-hop. That spoke to me as kind of, I think from a very young age, I think just growing up Palestinian, just de facto, you're aware of the world in a little bit of a different way. And I always had an affinity for justice, and I didn't necessarily know how to articulate that, but in my high school years, I remember going to the Deep South. I had this really cool history teacher. He was this, former, well, maybe he was still a lefty, but he was a high school teacher, but from the Bronx, and he was lived during the the anti-war movement during Vietnam, and we learned post-war America, and I was never really interested in American history because I was always taught that was a really short and horrible history of pillaging and all of that. But
genocide and
colonialism, all that stuff. It's not, but it was in that class in high school where we learned about, this more to the civil rights movement than you read in a book.
Yeah.
The kind of...
Because it was his lived experience.
So he would take us down to New York, and we'd follow, we read Catcher in the Rye as a history book and not as an English book.
Right.
But then we also went to the Deep South and really talked to folks who were on the front lines in the civil rights movement, and it was a lot more militant and organized than what we learned. These kind of glossed over chapters in the history books of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and so on.
Because
and
you're
so
meeting
forth. You're meeting people
in the place.
Yeah, in the place. And I went to Mississippi, and
this was part of a high school class.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So
do you ever think back and you're just thank you?
We were really lucky.
Thank you.
He's definitely in my story, and I think that was the first time. And I remember we went back to to my parents' homeland as much as we could. It was an expensive trip, but I remember going every 8 years. But as a kid, you don't really. It feels very disjointed. But I do remember going in '94. It was the only time that I went to Gaza.
Okay.
And had been the first time my mom went. It was when they, during the so-called peace accords, when they opened up the borders a little bit, and we were able to go in. And I was just so wrecked. As a child, I was 11, and to see that, and then to go into my formative years in high school and try to make sense of that, but it just all
Reconcile it
made
all.
sense when I went to places like Mississippi and Montgomery and all these places that the stories that people were telling me didn't feel much different than the stories that I was hearing about Gaza and what I like literally witnessed as a child. And
So you were making
yeah,
connections
I was
as
making
you're
connections
a
to the struggles
teenager?
of like black and brown communities here. And you know, as a stranger in a strange land, that like I felt like I clung on to that. I didn't necessarily know that the connections were all that. Like obviously, as an
Obvious.
adult now, we know the connections are very real of the same people who are doing the same things. But at least I had some kind of compass point of like I'm gonna like stand for justice and
Okay.
and I'm gonna do work in social justice. And
Was that before food for
Before
you?
food, yeah.
Food for you, yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, food had, ironically, and I talk about this, you know, much later on.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I wanted to stay as far away from food as possible.
Interesting.
Because I saw my mom struggle to have to cook food and like, you know, I was like, it's the feminist thing to do. I'm never going to be in the kitchen, you know.
Because that's expected.
Because it's expected of
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
Although I
yes.
had, like, I remember, I have these memories, and everybody who knows I'm a chef now, we're like, oh yeah, that checks. I was like, what? Like, I was totally unaware. There are obviously these, like, dissonance that you have, because it's like, they're related to trauma in some sort of way, but I was always, like, coming home after home ec classes, like, making the cookies and the pretzels. I had, like, an affinity for baking, for sure.
Okay.
But, like, I think as, like, cooking the foods of my people and all of that, there's complicated relationship to that.
Right.
And that's probably a whole other episode. But I was never a cook in the family. My sister was the cook. I tried
I was
going to
ask about
I was the book
siblings.
nerd.
You were the
Yeah.
book nerd.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was like, I'm going to like, you know, become the president of the first Arab Muslim woman president of the United States, you know, that kind of like, I'm just going to prove them all. you know?
Brainiac.
Yeah, I was a
The
brainiac.
brainiac
Yeah.
way.
I was like lost in the books.
You mentioned a sister. Is it just the two of you? Or are there
It was
other
three
other siblings?
girls.
3 girls.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and I was the eldest.
Oh.
So naturally, there was a lot of pressure on me. I had to break a lot of molds in my
Yes.
family as
Yes.
being the first.
As the youngest of 3, and we're all boys, I mean, I don't have a good relationship with my oldest brother, but in a way, I'm like, thank you for paving the way and letting me get away with everything.
Absolutely everything. I know.
Is it your
Every
younger
time
sister?
my
Yeah,
youngest
yeah.
sister. I was like, what? She was able to go to the prom without, you know, like.
Yeah, I'm very interested in general in like sibling dynamics and the number of children in a household and how
Yeah.
everyone fits in
Yeah,
birth
well,
order.
it was a very feminine household, and that was interesting. Like I always had this complex that my dad always, well, clearly he always he wanted to have a boy, and they just kept trying until like by the 3rd time, my mom was like, no, not happening.
She done,
you know,
yep.
and my parents are since divorced, and I think that kind of like had a
Strain.
strained effect on me and my father, because I always felt like I wanted to be that eldest son that I never was, you know, like
okay.
that he never had.
Right.
And, you know, with like put layers of like culture and then religion on top of that, and like what his expectations of me were versus what my own expectations on myself. Yeah, it was really hard. And him and my mother had a strained marriage for a very long time. But they eventually, when I went to college, like when I was 19, that relationship kind of came to its last straw, and I always internalized it was my fault, and it was all these things, right? Because I was very much an extension of my mom, very strong-willed, and you know, the way that she frustrated him, I internalized that I frustrated him, which I probably did, but and they went through this divorce, and it was in 2001.
Oh yeah.
Right around the time that 9/11 happened. 2 weeks into my, I
you
went
just
to
started
Tufts. Yeah, I had started
college.
university.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
like, and that was like, yeah, me exiting from the house, like wanting to assert my independence is a really complicated thing. And then 2 weeks into my time at Tufts, 9/11 happened, and that just kind of forever changed everything. I mean, we had grown up obviously with some anti-Arab sentiment and Islamophobia, because we were, the Gulf War was happening. Obviously, Palestinians were always in the news, and we were always kind of viewed as the terrorists and whatnot. So we had to battle that to a certain extent, but not to the level that I experienced.
And it was cranked.
And it was cranked.
Yeah.
So that put a real strain, and then I was in this this academic setting that was supposed to be like the beacon of liberalism or whatever I thought was like progressive at the time, and I studied international relations, and all they were teaching me was like the way to maintain peace is for the U.S. to have control over everybody and everything. And
at Tufts, they taught
Tufts.
this.
Yeah, they were teaching that, and it was like this poison that was being fed to me.
Yeah.
And then I had the divorce of my parents and 9/11, and so I experienced a lot of strain in what already was like years leading up to that.
Right.
And I developed. So I went to the Arab world in 2002. I don't know why I thought that was a good escape.
Okay.
Which is crazy to go to Lebanon and Syria. When I came back, I developed a weird kind of what I thought was a parasite, but I just could not eat, and I was really sick, and acid reflux and regurgitating, and just really, really bad stomach bug, and I just stopped being able to really eat, and then that affected the way I showed up in school, how I was around everything. I isolated, and then that turned
still at Tufts or
at Tufts, yeah.
Okay.
And it turned into sort of a depression, and it's hard to know where it's like a chicken and egg thing, because I was so depressed not being able to kind of live my normal life, but life wasn't normal, and that was affecting everything, and so I just didn't know to heal from it, and I had dropped, within 3 months, a good 30 pounds or something crazy like that. And everybody thought I had an eating disorder, but it wasn't an eating disorder. It was some form of eating disorder now in retrospect, but I was seeing every gastroenterologist. So my relationship with food became this really, really weird thing. Fraught.
Is that fair?
Yeah. I had something had weaponized it against me. And I knew that if I had continued at Tufts, I wouldn't have survived it. I was really on the brink of death, and my mom was really worried about me. And so during that kind of semester, my sophomore winter, when you take a break, it was the cold blizzards of Boston, and that didn't
help anything.
Because I didn't have any energy levels. I wouldn't do anything. So I was like, I need to leave. And she's like, where are you going to go? And I said, California. And
the hair on my entire
plan.
body's standing. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Please continue. Yeah, that's amazing.
I remember the night as if it was yesterday, she threw me on the scale, and I was 113 pounds, and I was 5'7". That's not healthy.
Nothing. No.
Yeah. I weigh a good 165 now, so if you can imagine. And I had done so much damage, and she was...
That's a 50% from that low.
Yeah. And so, she was do anything, whatever you need to do. And I first thought about my grandparents, but I thought LA would really depress me, kind of what I was looking for. And so my uncle and aunt happened to be living in Daly City, and they were people I grew up with. As a young kid, our house is also an Airbnb for family members passing through. And my uncle went to UMass Amherst when he was younger. He was half a generation above me, and he was an activist. And I used to look up to him. I remember. And then his wife at the time, she was this white California hippie girl from Humboldt, and loved her. And I was just that could be a good change of pace for me. So
to be with them. But had you visited there
no,
before? So
not really. I didn't
hadn't
know
been to the Bay Area yet?
I think as a 13-year-old once we visited for their wedding, but it was very short. So I know nothing about it.
You didn't get much of an impression of the place, but you loved them.
I loved them.
So you're I want to try that
they could be more of a slow pace, So I made my way, fraught and frail, to the Bay Area, to
This is
Daly
like
City, foggy Daly City.
3 or so?
No, I was in 2001.
Oh, this is
like
right.
2002.
I'm so sorry. My
No, it was
timeline
like
in my
right
head is off.
around the time, and there was a lot of organizing happening here. And if you remember during that time, that was the invasion of Iraq.
Around the Iraq War, yes.
My aunt and uncle were, my uncle had an engineering job. My aunt was working for like a women's funding network or something like that. And so by day they were working their jobs, and by night they were going to these like activist meetings. And that was like when I was introduced to anti-war organized. I would just come with them, and I was totally like dead. At that point,
still
I was
recovering,
a little bit recovering.
Yeah, but
I wasn't
slowly.
eating well. I was trying to like see doctors and figure out what my situation is. But they were like, "Come with us to these meetings." Yeah, I got familiar with a lot of the Palestinian student organizing activism at State, and that was really loaded. I remember there was like the mural situation. And I'm not a stranger to murals being controversial. We can get to that, but
sure.
But yeah, I remember the day that it was March 19th, I think.
That they started bombing.
They invaded, and everybody was out in the streets. And I think it took me out of like whatever was going on internally for me to something that was bigger than me.
That got you out of it.
Yeah. Kind of. I mean, it wasn't overnight. I didn't snap out of it overnight, but it slowly started. And my aunt and uncle were like amazing, like home cooks, and they like bought everything local. It was the first time I was introduced to a farmer's market. I was like, oh, this is a real tomato. Like, that's what they look like. I was just an East Coast kid, and I didn't have an appreciation for ingredients and food in the way that I think some of the folks who are really privileged to be able to do that out here.
We're so lucky to be situated on the earth where we are.
Yeah,
because
of
what's able to happen
the climate.
here.
And it makes sense why certain immigrants, that's why it's so diverse here. People find a terrain that's similar to theirs. And so I started cooking to reintroduce food to my systems, because I had so much trauma over anything I couldn't eat that I had to learn how to cook for myself.
Okay.
And I had ended up in the hospital to really make the change that I needed. And there were
out here or
out back in Boston. And so there were the Western doctors are like, you have to stay away from this and that. It was like and it was like not fun, So to learn how to heal myself in a way that's like, listen to what the food tells you or what the ingredients, and then to enjoy the act of cooking food and enjoying it. I don't know. There was just something that I learned over time. And so every week we would cook and like pull out the cookbooks. And
you cooked with your aunt and uncle?
With my aunt and uncle. Yeah. Okay. And so I think that was where food was started to introduce itself again to me in a formal way. To be joyful. And not a place of pain.
And healing, right.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And so I was doing that as I was like doing the social justice work. So it was like these parallel tracks that felt like they were very much pivotal to my healing phase. Yeah. In my cookbook, I have a whole chapter that says, an Arab finds her vegetable roots.
Puns. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I think I should mention that it took me 6 years to come up with this for my podcast, but my tagline is artists, activists, and small businesses. And I'm realizing already, talking to you, that you check all 3 boxes, and that's awesome. Thank you.
But what other stuff? An artist,
Yeah. So besides food and your sort of entry into actual activism, what else is going on in your life? Like it sounds like you were cooking. You were discovering cooking as a source of joy and nourishment. But this probably was the farthest thing from your mind back then.
Oh yeah. So, I wasn't thinking about that.
You were staying in Daly City, but like
I was living basically on the streets of the Mission, and really the Mission was a formative place for me. Actually, like that whole Valencia stretch, like the it used to be like what we call the communist building.
Oh yeah,
16th and Valencia. Now that's an Arab Resource and Organizing Center, which is what I was a founding member of. So it all kind of comes full circle.
Yeah.
And on the weekends, we were escaping to, when we weren't on the streets, we were escaping to Mendocino, to Humboldt, to Santa Cruz. Like I was learning about these really beautiful spaces, Muir Woods. I was like hiking. I didn't know what the art of like walking, you know.
Yeah.
So all of those were very spiritual parts of my healing to kind of decolonize my mind, if you will, because I just had so much trauma from like everything that I had experienced in my high school years, not realizing that this was happening to me, right? 9/11, I think, really kind of just unearthed so many of these pain points, and the failures of my parents' marriage and how intertwined I was with that. I mean, I had been dealing with depression since I was 13 years old. So mental health was always kind of a piece of the work, and it still is, you know, till this day. Every era, I have different relationships to it, but it's still there.
Right. You said we were going up to Humboldt and Mendocino.
Me and my aunt and uncle.
Okay.
Yeah, they had been like, so then eventually I went back and I finished. I was able to get my degree.
From Tufts?
From Tufts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and but then I immediately like moved back out here and I landed a job in 2005 with an organization called Center for Third World Organizing.
I've heard of that.
And it was kind of a dream job because I was basically running an apprenticeship program for young organizers of color.
Yes.
And we were supporting campaigns all over the country.
Okay.
All the way from New Orleans to like St. Paul, Minnesota.
Oh, wow.
You know, and learning the fundamentals of like organizing. And so I got to see a lot of campaigns and how communities and...
I'm sorry, I'm remembering back like the whole Obama phenomenon and how it was...
People didn't know what organizers were, right?
Community, especially community organizers,
Yeah.
and how a certain population in our country, how that became a bad word.
Yeah.
Because of Obama, and oh my God, like so much
funny
to
because
unpack there.
I feel like he just mainstreamed it. My dad was like, I don't know what she does for a living in our country. We just do that. We just take out our presidents. We don't get paid to do that.
Right,
you know?
right.
My dad would tell me like, oh yeah, I used to go out in the villages and like, he was very like, from a young, like you learn these things about your parents after the fact. And my parents were very worried. Like my dad, in particular, was definitely like had like some sort of revolutionary past, and then that all got deflated, and then he went the other way and became like a lot more conservative. As
Overcompensated
kind of
for himself.
He overcompensated for like this, like his heart broke, you know. He watched, you know, his country being taken over by dictators, and the Palestinian cause never getting any better, and so I think in a way that my parents just really did not know what I was doing. They were like, oh, okay, I guess she like, but when Obama, I do remember that in Syria, I remember he would explain, he'd be speaking to people in Arabic. He's like, yeah, she like goes and tells the workers like what their rights are, and they're like, oh, like the union. And yeah, I was a union organizer for a while, so I went from doing that where I wanted to be more on the ground. I just like had an affinity for like just that transformative work of being in contact with people. And but like working in the union was really, really hard.
Was that here? That was in the city.
Yeah, I worked with SEIU 1877. They're no longer, but with if you are familiar with the Justice for Janitors campaign, I was I was responsible for helping organize the workers to unionize in the airports.
Oh.
So all of the folks after 9/11 who got fired from TSA.
Right.
A lot of them were immigrants. A lot of them were from the black community, and they had to take a literacy test to get back into those jobs. So there was like really a way to like weed out, and then so they re-entered the workforce for these subcontracted companies of like Southwest, so that Southwest didn't have to unionize or pay them well.
And to get paid less.
Yeah,
of course,
exactly.
of course.
They had no benefits.
Right.
These were like, some of these airport workers are like responsible for our security, baggage handling, the folks who cart the wheelchairs, and we're being paid like less than $10 an hour in Silicon Valley.
Right.
You know, so. That was like a really amazing job, but it was like really hard work to work with the union because you had to do electoral work, and it was just like they.
Right.
Ironically, you just got not treated well being a union worker when you were advocating for
Imagine
workers'
that.
rights. You
Right,
know?
right.
So I left, and then I went into policy where I could organize. I was a community benefits organizer where I had the best of both worlds, where I work with community and workers to come up with policies that would make it easier for people to get living wages, affordable housing.
I'm also thinking, when I hear the word policy, I'm thinking smart people.
Yeah.
And we talked about your sort of brainiac
Yeah,
intellectual thing. So
there was a little bit of that, although I learned that like I didn't need any of my college degree for some of this stuff. Maybe, I don't know.
Isn't that the story of college?
Yeah, it was such an expensive, and I'm still resentful. I'm still paying.
Yeah.
20-something years later. Yeah, in retrospect, I guess having a Tufts degree may get you some, but I hardly use it. And
Right.
it's not really what led to my success. I think
Right.
the hardships and overcoming those hardships, certainly,
I was wondering, about your social life in these years, these sort of like, being here, leaving, coming back. Was it mostly from the circles that you're...
Yeah, I kind of developed, like when you're doing organizing work, you gravitate towards movement folks in the nonprofit, artists, teachers,
artists,
like
activists,
educators,
and small businesses.
Yeah, it's all exactly. It's all like it's a very cliche Bay Area, but like one of the ways that I built my fun fact, we're in a book actually. I think it's called How Soccer Changed the World, and I was on an anti-imperialist soccer team.
Awesome.
Called Left Wing Football Club, the Futbolistas. And I don't know, it was like a neighbor was like, I was like, I want to get into like just like exercising a little bit, and they're like, you should meet these folks, they're all like organizers, but they play soccer on Sundays. And then that became kind of my church.
That was Reem Assil of Reem's, California. Check back next week for part 2, when Reem will share the story of how she found cooking and opened her restaurant. Part 2 drops next Tuesday, wherever you get podcasts. Music for Storied San Francisco was produced, performed, and curated by Otis McDonald. Aaron Lim of Bitch Talk Podcast is our contributing producer. And the show is produced and hosted by me, Jeff Hunt. Now in our 6th season, we have more than 200 episodes available on our website, storiedsf.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're able to, please rate and review the show, and drop us a line at storiedsf@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Keep rejecting those silly doom loop narratives about our city. Stay wacky, weird, healthy, and creative. And we'll see you next time on Storied San Francisco. We acknowledge and respect the first humans of the unceded land we call San Francisco, the Ramaytush Ohlone. We condemn the genocide of these and other tribes across the Western Hemisphere. We honor their legacy and history, and we support rematriation and sovereignty efforts.
This podcast is a proud member of the BFF.FM podcast network. Learn more at podcasts.bff.fm.
BFF.FM, best frequencies forever.